So the idea here is that the classification system that we've come to take on, and this is based on the UK's Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, which is very similar classification to the New Zealand system. But the classification system that is being used in the UK does not necessarily map directly onto the harms as described by a group of medical and scientific experts looking specifically at the conditions and the environment of drug use in the United Kingdom. And David Nutt and his colleagues have argued very strongly for the changing of these classifications for a number of reasonably obvious reasons. And his most recent broadside at the classifying authorities in this regard got him sacked from being chair of this committee, because basically they didn't like to, they basically didn't want to hear what he was saying. And so this is one of these, this is part of this again, this notion on the one hand of the fluidity of how we perceive drugs, but also coming back to this notion of hegemony. In other words, having a set of dominating ideas which control how the discourse plays out, and that this dominating set of ideas is not necessarily related to evidence. It draws on other factors. It draws on moral preferences and the preferences of the time, and it also reflects the views of a dominant group of people. I guess just summing up with the previous stuff, the point being made here really, I guess, is that all the way through these talks, I've sort of emphasised that the way that we think about drug use and drug users is fluid. It's mediated by a whole lot of factors. It's not something that's direct and that's obvious and that's true. The view that we hear or see in the media or on the news or read in the newspaper or the portrayal of drug use is not necessarily true. It's just how it's described, and frequently it's how it's described by a particular group of people with a particular set of ideas about it. And I guess that's the sort of take-home message really. And so when we then take a very common drug and illegal drug, and cannabis is the most common illegal drug used, most frequently used illegal drug, or commonly used illegal drug in the world, not only in New Zealand, but basically everywhere around the world. And when we look at this, then we can then see, first of all, the kinds of information that people use to generate an idea about drug use, and then as we'll see next week, we'll look at some of the other views of the users themselves, because one of the main voices, I would argue, that is silent in this discourse, the overall discourse around drug use, is the voice of users. We do not hear from cannabis users or drug users, because drug users are seen as deviant, as criminal, as pathologised. Okay, they're not people whose opinions we need to listen to. They're a threat. And as a consequence of that, if you can characterise a group of people like that, it then becomes very easy to talk about them without including them in the conversation. And so if that relates to things like policy and health outcomes, I would say that we've actually got a problem here. Because
it's innate in the legislation though, if something is illegal, then to voice opposition to that, you're singling yourself out.
Oh, you're immediately sticking your head up above the ramparts. And I mean, if you're a drug user, that's you can, in a sense, you might say, well, I can kind of understand how that people might respond like that, you know. But if you're a professional of psychiatry and you still get exactly the same reaction, then you have to say, well, what is this about? Is this about people and a certain kind of behaviour, or is this about some other category? And this comes back to the idea of the signs and so on, and the type of language that we use.
I mean, I was just noticing, like when you're talking about a drug user, you know, you'd automatically think about illicit drugs. Well, yeah. Alcohol is a drug, so
of course it is.
But you categorise people straight away by just.
But what do we talk about if we talk about the treatment sector? We talk about AOD, alcohol and other drugs. So there's this constant separation of the apparently acceptable drugs, which, as we've already noted, are actually quite dangerous. Tobacco and alcohol, both in the top 10, alcohol in the top 5.
It's interesting, I read some data, I some time ago, I don't know where it's from, about nicotine can be, people smoking nicotine when they're 10 or 11. It can almost be a gateway to that. It's an indicator that they will be doing other drugs.
I think that would be undeniable.
Yeah.
And alcohol, of course.
Yeah.
There's very common drugs.